And people are raising serious concerns over questionable spending of taxpayer and tuition money by Connecticut state colleges and university staff members. This following the release of a financial audit by the state's comptroller. Your reporter, Marcy Jones, joins us now live from the state capitol with the details. Good morning, Marcy.
Good morning, Roger. Well, if you've never heard of a P card before, it's a state-issued credit card given to the university's presidents, their chancellor, as well as some select staff members. Now, let's break down some of the most controversial charges on those cards that were discovered within the comptroller's report. At the request of Governor Ned Lamont, the state comptroller has spent the last 2 months combing through financial records by Connecticut state colleges and universities. The audit shows taxpayer and student tuition dollars was used for hotels, chauffeurs, lavish meals, and dry cleaning bills. Post-review comptroller Sean Scanlon has made 10 recommendations. He hopes they'll be adopted during the legislative session at the beginning of the new year. The #1 recommendation is to reinstate the internal audit function, a unit that CSCU previously eliminated.
He spent about $19,000 in the period of 3 fiscal years that we looked at on meals. Despite having a state vehicle on 3 occasions, he paid for a car service.
CSCU Chancellor Chang has released a statement saying, in part, quote, "We are reviewing the recommendations and findings from the comptroller's office and are committed to implementing stronger controls, policies, and comprehensive training." Now, some lawmakers are actually calling for Chancellor Chang's termination. Your reporter in Hartford, Marcy Jones, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
All right, Marcy, thank you.